There's a ton of noise out there. So, how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to the Why Podcast Work series here on B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. I'm joined today by Daniel Oyston. He is the co-founder of SponServe and also the host of the Inside Sponsorship podcast. Daniel, how you doing today, man?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Logan. I've been on the other side of the microphone a fair number of times interviewing guests just like you, so it's kind of cool to be the one being interviewed for a change.
Yeah, it's always fun when the script gets flipped on you. Awesome, man. Well, Daniel, as I mentioned, you are a co-founder of SponServe. You've been the host of the Inside Sponsorship podcast. You also run Content Grasshopper on the agency side. Tell us a little bit about yourself. And I know there's a fun story behind the name of your agency, Content Grasshopper, as well.
So the bottom line is I'm a marketer, but I like to say that I'm one of those rare marketers out there who's worked before all the digital marketing evolved and really came to the fore. So I've worked in the traditional space, but also obviously in the current space. Add to that, I actually have qualifications in marketing with a Master of Marketing, and I've also taught marketing at university over the years. I also like to say that there aren't too many industries that I haven't worked in or consulted in across both marketing and sales. And some of the big ones have included industries like sports, project management, software, IT, education, not-for-profits, and charity. So I've sold and marketed to parents looking to help get their kids into education through to Australian government departments looking to improve their project management, and then right through to places like Premier League football teams in England. As you said at the start of the show, I was a co-founder and director at SponServe, which was the world's first cloud-based sponsorship management platform for both rights holders and brands. Classic startup story where the idea was discussed over a beer back in mid-2013, and we started the business from our lounge rooms and then grew it into a worldwide business, which was acquired by Core in November 2018. So I still do some marketing work for SponServe and Core, but do that through my one-man marketing consultancy called Content Grasshopper. And Content Grasshopper focuses mainly on helping businesses unpack their expertise and create awesome content that usually focuses on marketing through teaching, because I feel that marketing through teaching demonstrates your expertise and it builds trust, and people buy off people that they trust. And that keeps me pretty busy. The name Content Grasshopper, some of the listeners would remember a show called Kung Fu. And early on, there is a scene where Master Po meets a new student, Kane. Kane is surprised that Master Po can't see, right? So he's blind. And he thinks that's just a terrible way to live, not being able to see. But Master Po challenges him and says, "Why don't you strike me with your broom?" And Kane, he's only a little kid, right? So he's a bit hesitant to attack an old blind man, but Master Po insists. And so Kane tries to strike him with the broom, but Master Po just defends himself pretty easily. Kane gets up, he has a second gaze, a little bit more determined, but it's pretty much the same result. Master Po defends himself. He actually takes the broom off Kane and throws it at him before Kane picks himself, dusts himself off, and has one last go, but it's pretty much the same result. Master Po, the old blind man, he's hardly even trying. And Master Po eventually tells Kane to close his eyes, and he asks Kane, "What do you hear?" And Kane says that he can hear the water and he can hear the birds. And Master Po asks him, can you hear your own heartbeat? To which Kane says he can't. Then Master Po says to him, can you hear the grasshopper at your feet? Now, Kane can't help himself, and he opens his eyes and he looks down, and sure enough, there's a grasshopper sitting right next to him at his feet. And Kane says, oh man, how is it that you can hear and see these things? To which Master Po replies, young man, how is it that you do not? So for me, that is exactly how I feel about content marketing and even podcasts now. Too many businesses are Kane with his broom, running around, swinging it without really thinking and not being successful with their marketing. And their target audience just bats them away easily and doesn't give them their attention. Businesses can't see that the overwhelming majority, like 88% of people, research services and products online before buying, and that they actually move through that buyer decision-making process 60 to 70% of the way before making contact with a company. And that's why content and podcasts, I think, are so important. And I can't understand how many more businesses, just like Kane, can't see or hear it. And so that's my background, and that's where the name Content Grasshopper came from.
I love that. That's such a phenomenal story. And I love the analogy that you're pointing out there. There's things that are just sitting right at our feet that we are completely missing. So, Daniel, tell us a little bit more about your path to podcasting. I know as you and I have talked about this, both being podcast hosts in the past, there were a couple of things that you mentioned that I thought would be great to share with listeners. One, you noticed specifically in the industry that you were focusing on in SponServe, there was content that really wasn't delivering a ton of tactical value in other formats, say, at conferences and keynotes, and then also as a way to build your network and to be able to approach decision makers at target accounts. Can you speak to both of those strategies that led you into podcasting and some of those things that you saw as you in the early days of starting your podcast of Inside Sponsorship?
Sure. So I've go back to square one. I've always been someone who feels they need to be across anything that either a boss, when I had a full-time job and was employed by somebody else, or now a client might come to me and ask about. Now, admittedly, with so many platforms now, that becomes harder and harder each month. But I've also generally worked in organisations and with clients where there isn't a huge budget or some big agency that's on the side helping support what we're trying to do. And so often, if I wanted to implement something new, I had to learn how to do it myself and then do it for that business or client, which is fine. I actually like that. And so what it means is that over the years, I've taught myself things like graphic design, video editing, how to build websites, and of course, podcasting. When I first started Content Grasshopper, podcasting was really only just starting to grow. But I thought to myself, well, I better get across this podcasting thing. Early days, I was creating content for Content Grasshopper more as a show of skills, a portfolio of sorts, rather than actually to try and bring in work for my business, because I was pretty busy already and I didn't really have any big designs on wanting to try and grow and have lots of stuff. So like the content I was creating was more portfolio based rather than lead generation focused. I was writing a blog once a week, and so I thought I'll just grab a basic USB headset and mic, right? Like surely the sound will sound fine. That's how people record, and just read the 4 blogs back each month that I'd written and sort of just cut them up into a podcast with a bit of an intro and outro and a few segues and things like that. Just to see how editing software worked, how to get it into iTunes and all those things that I probably didn't know anyway. Just so that if a client ever asked, I could say, oh, yes, sure, I can do podcasts for you. At the end of the day, the sound was terrible. I don't really know if anyone listened, but just reading blogs back was super boring, even for me. And the show just had no energy. So I spoke to a friend in town where I live who also works in marketing. He works by himself. And I asked him if he'd be keen to sort of, co-host this podcast with me, because I figured that having a co-host would give it more energy and ideas and someone to help me keep going. Because like I said, even I was bored by it, but I could still see the potential for others and I wanted to keep my finger in the pie, so to speak. So my friend said yes. And so then I spoke to another friend who managed a co-working space, and asked if we could use one of his rooms to record free of charge, and in return insert an ad in the show for them to promote their co-working space. And then because we used to record on a Friday afternoon, I spoke to another friend who owned a local brewery and asked him to donate some beers for us during the show, which we would then drink to help loosen us up, and we would provide a little review and put an ad in the show for the brewery and try and help him out. And so that meant I got to upgrade my equipment, and really we just interviewed interesting businesses about their journey and their marketing. Still no real direction or clear goals for the show, just really learning by doing. But when Sponsor started, I saw a real opportunity to use podcasting to help with brand awareness and account-based marketing, because no one was doing anything deep like that in the sponsorship space, especially with podcasts. There was no sponsorship podcasts. And as a cash poor startup, we needed marketing that we could execute on a really tight budget, because anything that we spent, we had to put in from our own bank accounts, but which did give us a big impact. And we thought podcasts definitely fitted that bill. And that's how we started the show.
I love that story, and hearing the evolution from just recording with an initial headset, bringing in the brewery. Like, that is just a phenomenal path to podcasting that you don't always hear. So tell us a little bit about how you set out to engage folks. You mentioned account-based marketing. How did account-based marketing fit into the early days of the Inside Sponsorship podcast?
So, as you said, the show's called Inside Sponsorship, which is a hat tip to the term inside baseball, which your American listeners would probably be familiar with. But for those who aren't, it basically means expert knowledge or really technical knowledge that a mainstream audience or a layperson wouldn't understand. In other words, you have to work inside the industry to really get it and to understand it. So that's what we focus on, sponsorship, for both rights holders, so those people seeking sponsorship, sports teams, charities, events, and the brands who are sponsoring them. But in-depth and candid content that you probably won't find as a blog on a website or people talking about at a conference. It also has a great synergy, I think, the word inside, and this wasn't deliberate. It's just a byproduct or a little serendipitous occurrence. But the word has great synergy inside, because we are taking listeners inside other people's sponsorship programs on both sides of the fence, which they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. But before we launched, and probably even still now, the industry was going to conferences and hearing from really important players in the industry, but just being fed the same, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but just being fed the same shallow content year in, year out. So they were getting these big, important headlines that they should be focusing on. Things like sponsorship should be a relationship, not just a transaction. Big headlines like those that they should focus on, but no real detail on how to execute under those. And so we saw an opportunity to stand out with great content in a podcast. But there was also a great opportunity, as you said, with account-based marketing to connect with decision makers, because of how podcasts are so personal and how people build listening to shows into their routines, and you become part of their life each week or each fortnight as they go to the gym or garden or walk the dog. So we felt that gave us an opportunity to really build credibility before we even made contact with decision makers, or to help nurture decision makers that we were already speaking to and had relationships with by inviting them onto the show as guests. You know, there's always that little bit of an ego thing as well. I still think that there is an opportunity for lots of businesses in the podcasting space. There's a lot of focus on entertainment podcasts and true crime podcasts, and they are great and they will always have their place. The people that make those podcasts, the conversation is often around getting as many listeners as possible so that they can build this huge audience and then sell ads in their podcast. Now, that's a pretty well-worn path, right? And it's one that as a communications industry, a wider communications industry, we've been professing the death of for some time. But a lot of podcasts want to keep going down that path. And that's okay if you can make it work, but it's exactly what television, radio, and newspapers have been doing forever. And that's fine. But for most businesses, it's not really a viable path. for businesses, I think the focus should be much more on engaging your target audience, irrespective of the size somewhat. So if your goal is to get a meeting with X company and a decision maker in that company listens to your show or comes on your show as a guest and then takes a meeting, why do you care if they are the only person who listens to your show, so long as the ROI of that process is okay for your business? You are more successful with a listenership of 5 or so people who are all in your target audience and who end up taking a meeting with you than someone creating a show with thousands of listeners but no income or real way to convert those listeners. I don't think your target audience cares how many people listen to your show as long as that individual loves the content that you are producing. So my advice would be to not focus on volume of listeners as much and focus on quality of content, which funnily enough, if you create great content, you'll create a big following. But the following is actually a byproduct of great content.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, Daniel. It's great to hear someone else from outside the Sweet Fish team echoing, what we talk about all the time. We actually headed down our path to podcasting, realizing that, hey, there is power in the relationships that you can form even before your podcast has a lot of listeners. And even if it has a small amount, if those are in the right niche, then you're heading down the right road. And as you mentioned, there's the account-based marketing strategy of sharing that content with individuals at your target accounts to nurture those relationships. But part of nurturing that relationship can be to have them on as a podcast guest, not only a listener. Go straight to them. So I love hearing that. Can you tell some stories of some of the benefits you started to see for Sponserve with the Inside Sponsorship podcast? I know there were some stories about people referencing it in sales conversations and engaging some target accounts. What were some of those? And I think there are some good stories to kind of put some light to some specifics for folks.
Some great stories, and ones that as a podcast host and producer make you walk a little bit taller with your chest out a little bit more, because it makes you feel really special that the content that you're creating and the product that you're putting out for people really does resonate and help them with their jobs. In the early days, I think the biggest benefit for us was just credibility for the brand. So as I mentioned before, podcasts are so personal and the content really does build trust with people, and they feel like they know the host and the staff that come on the show regularly. But for example, the sales guys at Sponserve have walked into demo meetings to demonstrate the software, and straight away there's no need to do the whole credential building with the prospect, because that prospect's already listened to, say, 50 plus episodes of Inside Sponsorship. They already know the business and they trust us, and the sales team don't have to prove that they deserve some time in front of the prospect by trying to credential themselves and then build rapport with the prospect. I think an important aspect of that is that in our podcast, we don't push or ask for anything in the podcast. We just focus on helping the target audience. And over time, they see us more as wanting to be helpful rather than just a business who's trying to sell stuff, which that's what we are all trying to do, but we can go around that in different ways. So when we do get around to asking them for something, say a meeting, without making it sound too icky or sleazy or sales black magic, that prospect kind of feels that they need to put something back into the relationship. And so they say, yes, I'm happy to have a meeting. And they do so because we've come from a place of being so helpful for them with great content over such a long period of time. A key element of that is ensuring that the show doesn't push the software. It isn't a podcast where we mention and talk about the software all of the time and use the podcast as some sort of thinly veiled sales vehicle. We don't even have ads for our own product in the show, because my view is that if people want to find out more, I think they're smart enough to just put Sponserve into Google. And that's in there, the brand names in the intros and the outros and things like that. So don't get me wrong, we have calls to action for show notes and giveaways and other content that supports what we might be talking about. But I think we might have mentioned the software only 2 or 3 or 4 times over 70 odd episodes. And that is usually because we're interviewing a guest who is also a client and they bring it up in the conversation, not us. Another benefit, as you said, some stories about people helping promote our show. A great benefit is when potential clients and current clients actively promote our show to their peers who are also obviously our target audience. We had the head of sponsorship, for example, of an English Premier League football team tell us, I love your show. I've told about 40 people in sponsorship that they have to listen to it and they're mad if they don't. And that makes you feel really special. And another way that benefit happens is a lot of podcasters focus on how to promote their show. And the conversation nearly always centers around, how do I promote my show in social media? And should I be running ads on social media? But I can tell you that the best promotion for us, apart from our database and good word of mouth, has been getting the main guest on our show. So usually that person who's in our target audience, who has peers and has networks and connections with other people who are in our target audience, for them to share their individual episode with a little bit of a note on their personal and business social media accounts, especially LinkedIn, because as I said, they're usually connected with so many people who we are also trying to talk to. And it's very, very powerful stuff.
I love that. I know James has talked about that with our team as well, that borrowed brand equity, right? When that share, that promotion of that content comes from someone in your target audience, then it goes to more people in your target audience, but it doesn't come directly from your brand, but you're getting that exposure in that niche that you're trying to resonate with. I've heard James explain the analogy of, Oprah didn't become famous by telling her own story, which she actually has a fascinating backstory, but she became famous by interviewing other people. Most people say, well, yeah, she's interviewed Ellen DeGeneres and Tom Cruise and all these big names. Well, yeah, if you need to be known by hundreds of millions of people, maybe that makes sense. But to your point, Daniel, you likely have a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people in the niche that you serve that you're really trying to resonate with. And so if you connect with people in that target audience and they share the content, man, it's so powerful. And, what you mentioned earlier, the connection with that guest becomes very powerful as well. Was there anything from the onset that you really didn't expect that kind of took you by surprise as your path to podcasting evolved, Daniel?
I think one unexpected benefit has been just how much of a perceived personal connection we can make with listeners. That was never really spoken about in the early days, 5, 6, 7 years ago, because I'm not sure that as a podcasting industry we actually appreciated it a few years ago, but it is very, very powerful. For example, just over Christmas, I received an email from a long-time listener. Interestingly, he wasn't 100% in our target audience, but he actually loved the show and he listened anyway. And so he got in contact and just told me he'd taken a new role. Very exciting for him, obviously, but it was more sponsorship focused. So he was now is now squarely in our target market, but which was his new job is quite away from where he was living, so he has to relocate the family. And in Australia, it's a very big country, and so there are some very long drives that this guy and his family need to take. And on those long drives, he's actually, this is crazy, right? He's gone back and listened to every one of our episodes again. Like, I haven't even done that, and I'm the host. He even told me he did that with the family in the car. So he jokes now that his kids know more about sponsorship than he does. And the benefit there is that without any prompting from us as a brand, he said that once he has his feet under his new desk and he's been in the job for a little while, he'd love to take a demo of the software and see how it can help his new organization. And remember, we don't talk about the software in the podcast very much at all. I think probably another unexpected benefit has been more on a personal level in non-sponsorship related relationships. So the podcast industry is still emerging, and so it's easy to connect with some of the pioneers in the industry, particularly here in Australia. And some of those people have given me lots of different ideas and inspiration that I can take back to the show. But just as importantly, They help give me validation that I'm on the right path or I'm doing a certain thing the right way. Because the industry podcasting is still in its infancy somewhat. And I think probably one other unexpected benefit is how people who have been on the show or just listen to the show, as you said before, they will share shows and engage with people in our target audience and recommend the content. But the other thing that they start doing that never even crossed my mind is that they start sourcing guests for us. So they'll get in contact and say, oh, hi, Daniel, I know Greg or Mary over at company X or Y, and they do some awesome jobs. They're working on this project and they've got that sponsorship and they're building this and that. They'd make a great guest. Would you like me to make an introduction so that you can talk to them about coming on the show? And that just absolutely blows my mind.
Oh, that is fantastic. I've been on the other side of that as well. It is amazing how much the snowball effect of getting started and what can come from the community that you build with podcasting. And I think part of it comes back to something you've said before. You alluded to it a few minutes ago, Daniel, but you talked about it as we were chatting offline about the intimacy of podcasting. People feel like they are the only person who is the fly on the wall listening in on the conversation. And so that connection with the host, with the people from your brand who are involved in the show becomes very, very intimate much more quickly than in other media formats. And I've experienced that. Your stories illustrate that as well. Well, Daniel, as we wrap this up today, I would love for you to share, if you had one piece of advice for a room full of marketers or maybe sales leaders, because you've got marketing and sales hats that you've worn in the past, anybody who is thinking about starting a podcast for their brand, specifically in B2B, what piece of advice would you leave them with?
One piece of advice, I think that's hilarious because I'm a marketer, so keeping it to just one is like asking me which of my children I love the most. Look, I think assuming it's a business-to-business podcast, I think it would probably be best to start with the problems and the needs of your target audience. Your target audience have things that stress them out, problems they can't solve, things that keep them up at night. And so I think your job is to help them solve those things by teaching through your podcast. And teaching like that, I've said it before earlier, teaching like that demonstrates your expertise in a non-salesy way, and demonstrating your expertise builds trust that you can do what you say you can do. And once again, people buy off people they trust. You should never be worried about telling people how to solve their problems and giving away some of your secrets and processes and how you do things. I think of it the other way. Instead, you should be worried that not enough people know exactly how you can help them. Now, some people would argue that means people will just learn off you and do it all themselves. Sure, I agree, some will. But those people are never going to be your clients. And it's actually better to rule them out now and never fully engage with them, just give them content, as opposed to spending lots of time and detailed meetings and proposals and following them up, which just ends up being a waste of your time. And to be fair, I don't think there's many things that most businesses that we do for our target audience, our clients, that they can't find out about from other sources on the internet. So often it's not about whether they can or can't do it themselves, because there's usually somewhere where they can find out how to do anything they want to. It becomes a time thing, and then they spend money on it because they don't have the time, and they need to spend that money with people that they trust. And I think that sometimes a lot of us think that what we do for clients is somehow special, but it rarely is. And they choose us because they trust us. So they may as well, those people who are never going to be our clients, they may as well learn from us. And even if they then go and do it themselves, they'll still be fans of ours and provide word of mouth to those people in our target audience who don't have the inclination to do it themselves. And think about it. I always talk about this as an example because celebrity chefs have been doing it for years. They have detailed cooking shows. They take you step by step through how to make a dish, but they are not worried about the public, you and I, or other chefs watching and stealing their recipes, because they know that their personality and their content and their teaching builds trust, and then they sell them cookbooks, and those people visit their restaurants, and then they watch more of their shows where they're selling advertising, and then they even go out and buy the branded saucepans and frying pans and spatulas and things like that. They are not worried that the average person or other chefs are going to learn everything they know and open up a restaurant and put them out of business, because they know there is more to it. And for me, as I said right at the start of the show, I'm a marketer. So for me, that's marketing 101. Open any textbook on marketing, and it all starts with the target audience's need, want, or problem, and you build out a solution from there. And so if you're going to start a podcast, that's where you should start your show. Focus on the need or want or problem, and then create a show that addresses those, and don't be afraid to market through teaching.
I love it, Daniel. So some final thoughts. Focus on your target audience, biggest area of needs. Don't be afraid to share your secrets. That is actually probably one of your biggest levers to actually building trust with your target audience. And then focus on the relationships, both the intimate relationships you can create with listeners, but don't forget about the relationships that you can build and deepen with the guests of your show. Those were some of my big takeaways from all of the stories that you shared. I love riffing on this stuff. I love geeking out on podcasting and all things marketing, which is why I love being a podcaster and being able to interview marketers who are much smarter than myself and have different journeys. So Daniel, thank you for joining us and for sharing your journey, both in marketing and podcasting today. And this has been a ton of fun.
It has been a ton of fun. I loved it. And thanks for having me.
Awesome. Daniel, if anybody listening to this would like to follow up with you, where can they find you? Where can they find inside sponsorship in case they're in that arena and would like to tune into your show as well?
Sure. So just head to sponsor.net and just go to the resources and then the blog section. But if you search for inside sponsorship wherever you get your podcasts, you will find it both on Apple and Google. If you'd like to connect with me personally and as Logan says, just riff about marketing and podcasting, I'm always happy to have a chat and help people out and provide some direction. So you can find me at contentgrasshopper.com.au or just find me on LinkedIn.
I love it. Daniel, thanks so much, man. This has been a ton of fun.
My pleasure.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big 3, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.